In August 1943, George S. Patton was the most successful American general in Europe. His Seventh Army had just conquered Sicily faster than anyone thought possible, while British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery methodically advanced along the eastern coast. Patton had raced across the entire island in a bold end run that captured Palermo and reached Messina before anyone expected. He was aggressive, fearless, and victorious. Every military analyst agreed that Patton was the obvious choice to lead the Allied invasion of France. Eisenhower trusted him. His soldiers worshipped him. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. His face appeared on magazine covers across America. Parents named their sons after him. He stood at the absolute peak of his military career, a living legend at 60 years old. Then, in a single moment of uncontrolled rage inside a field hospital, Patton destroyed everything he had built. What he did in those 30 seconds was so shocking, so inexcusable, that Eisenhower seriously considered sending him home in permanent disgrace. This is the story of the slap that nearly erased George S. Patton from history, and how his own demons almost cost the Allies their greatest battlefield commander. The Sicilian campaign had been brutal. American soldiers fought through mountains, across rivers, under scorching summer heat that reached 110 degrees. They faced determined German defenders who made them pay for every mile. By early August, the hospitals behind the front lines were filled with wounded men. Some had shattered limbs from artillery shells. Others had burns from tank battles. Many had bullet wounds that would leave them scarred forever. But there was another category of casualties that the Army was only beginning to understand. They called it battle fatigue, shell shock, combat exhaustion. These soldiers had no visible wounds. Their bodies were intact. But something inside them had broken. They could not stop shaking. They could not sleep without screaming. They jumped at every sound. Some simply stared at nothing, their minds trapped in horrors they could not escape. The medical corps was overwhelmed. Doctors worked around the clock, treating physical wounds, and they were just beginning to recognize that psychological wounds could be equally devastating. General Patton, however, had no patience for invisible injuries. He believed that courage was a choice. He believed that any man who left the front lines without a physical wound was a coward. This belief was about to collide with reality in the most devastating way possible. August 3rd, 1943. The 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. General Patton arrived for what he considered a sacred duty. He visited wounded soldiers regularly, pinning medals on their chests, shaking their hands, thanking them for their sacrifice. He believed these visits boosted morale, and he was right. Soldiers who met Patton in the hospital often spoke about it for the rest of their lives. On this particular afternoon, Patton walked slowly between rows of cots, stopping at each bed. He spoke to a soldier who had lost his leg to a landmine. He congratulated a sergeant who had destroyed a German machine gun nest despite being shot twice. He pinned Purple Heart on a young private whose face was wrapped in bandages from burns. Then Patton reached a bed where a soldier sat, hunched over, his head in his hands. Private Paul Bennett, age 21. Patton looked at the admission chart. No wounds listed. The general's expression changed. His jaw tightened. He looked down at the trembling young man and asked a question that would begin the most damaging incident of his career. "What is wrong with you, soldier?" Private Bennett looked up at the general with hollow eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He had been in combat continuously for over a month. He had watched friends die beside him. He had killed men at close range. 4 days earlier, His best friend had been torn apart by an artillery shell while standing 3 feet away. Bennett had been covered in his friend's blood. Since then, he could not stop shaking. He could not hold his rifle steady. His commanding officer had finally ordered him to the rear when Bennett broke down crying during a German artillery barrage. The doctors diagnosed him with severe battle fatigue and admitted him for rest and observation. None of this mattered to Patton. The general saw only a young man with no visible wounds sitting in a hospital bed, while other soldiers fought and died at the front. Patton's face turned crimson with rage. He grabbed Bennett by the collar of his shirt and pulled him to his feet. "You are a coward," Patton shouted. His voice echoed through the hospital tent. Every patient, every doctor, every nurse turned to watch. Patton slapped Bennett across the face with his gloved hand, then shoved him back onto the bed. "You are going back to the front," Patton continued. "You're going to fight. I will not have cowards in my army." The medical staff stood frozen in shock. No one had ever seen a general strike a patient. Colonel Donald Currier, the hospital commander, stepped forward carefully. "General, this man is sick. He is not a coward. He is suffering from a genuine medical condition." Patton spun toward the doctor. "Medical condition? He is a yellow-bellied coward who is using this hospital to hide from the fighting. I want him out of this bed and back at the front by tomorrow." Patton stormed out of the tent, leaving behind a room full of stunned witnesses. Private Bennett sat on his bed, his face red from the slap, tears streaming down his cheeks. He kept repeating the same words over and over. "I am not a coward. I tried. I really tried." The nurses comforted him, while the doctors exchanged worried glances. They knew they had just witnessed something that could not be ignored. Colonel Currier immediately wrote a detailed report of the incident and sent it up the chain of command. He did not know that in exactly 1 week, Patton would do the same thing again, and that second incident would be even worse. The fuse had been lit on a scandal that would shake the entire American military establishment. August 10th, 1943. The 93rd Evacuation Hospital near Santa Agata di Militello. Patton arrived in a foul mood. The advance on Messina had slowed. Casualties were mounting. He blamed the delays on lack of aggressive spirit among his officers. He decided to visit the hospital to remind himself why the sacrifices were worth it, to see the brave men who had given everything for victory. The visit started well enough. Patton moved through the surgical ward, praising wounded soldiers, speaking words of encouragement. Then he entered a receiving tent where newly arrived patients waited for treatment. Sitting on a wooden box near the entrance was Private Charles Herman Kuhl, aged 26, from Indiana. Like Bennett a week earlier, Kuhl had no visible wounds. He sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. Patton approached him. The general's aide noticed Patton's expression darkening and felt a sudden sense of dread. He had heard rumors about an incident at another hospital. Now he watched as Patton stopped directly in front of the trembling private. "What is the matter with you?" Patton demanded. Kuhl looked up. "It is my nerves," he said quietly. "I can hear the shells coming, but I cannot move. I just cannot move anymore." Patton exploded with a fury that witnesses would never forget. "Your nerves. Your nerves. You are a coward. You are a disgrace to the Army. You are a disgrace to America." Patton slapped Kuhl across the face so hard that the private's helmet liner flew off and rolled across the dirt floor. But Patton was not finished. He grabbed Kuhl by the collar, pulled him to his feet, and slapped him again. Then, in a moment that would haunt him forever, Patton reached for his ivory-handled pistol and pulled it from its holster. He waved the weapon in Kuhl's face. "I ought to shoot you myself right now," Patton screamed. "I ought to shoot you right here and save the Army the trouble of court-martialing you for cowardice." The tent had gone completely silent. Soldiers, doctors, nurses all stared in disbelief. A 3-star general was threatening to execute a hospitalized patient. Patton shoved Cool toward the tent entrance. "Get this coward out of here. I will not have him in the same hospital as brave men who have been shot. Send him back to the front. If he will not fight, I will stand him up against a wall and have him shot for desertion." The hospital commander, Colonel Donald Odom, rushed to intervene. "General, please. This man has a temperature of 102 degrees. He has malaria in addition to battle fatigue. He is genuinely ill." Patton did not care. He turned back to Cool one final time, slapped him a 3rd time across the face, then kicked him as he stumbled toward the exit. The general stormed out of the tent and into his waiting staff car. As his driver pulled away, Patton was still shouting about cowards and the weakness of modern soldiers. Back inside the tent, Private Cool sat on the ground where he had fallen, his face swelling from the blows. Blood trickled from his mouth where his lip had split. A nurse knelt beside him, dabbing at the blood with a cloth. The doctors immediately documented everything. They noted the 3 slaps, the drawn pistol, the threats of execution, the kick. They measured the bruises on Cool's face. Colonel Odom wrote his report that same evening and sent it directly to the 7th Army surgeon. Within 48 hours, detailed accounts of both slapping incidents had reached the desk of General Omar Bradley, Patton's subordinate commander. Bradley read them with growing horror. Then he forwarded them to the one man who would have to decide what to do with this catastrophe: General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower received the reports on August 17th. He read them alone in his office in Algiers, and according to his aide, his hands trembled as he turned the pages. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean faced an impossible situation. George Patton was his best combat general. No one else could match his aggression, his instinct for battle, his ability to inspire soldiers to do the impossible. Eisenhower needed Patton for the upcoming invasion of France. Without him, the Allies would lose their most effective weapon against the German army. But what Patton had done was inexcusable. He had physically assaulted hospitalized soldiers. He had threatened to murder a patient in front of dozens of witnesses. He had violated every code of military conduct, every standard of officer behavior, every basic principle of human decency. If the story became public, Congress would demand Patton's dismissal. The American people would be outraged. Eisenhower's own judgment in keeping Patton would be questioned. The general sat at his desk for a long time, staring at the reports. Then he began to write. The letter he composed that night would remain classified for years, but its contents would determine whether George S. Patton had any future in the United States Army. Eisenhower's letter to Patton was brutally direct. "I have received official reports of 2 incidents involving physical violence against hospitalized soldiers under your command. The detailed accounts paint a picture of conduct that is completely unacceptable for any officer, let alone a general commanding an army." Eisenhower continued with specific instructions. "You will apologize to the individuals involved. You will apologize to the medical personnel who witnessed these incidents. You will apologize to every division in your command, in person, standing before the assembled troops. If there is any repetition of this behavior, I will relieve you of command immediately and send you home." The letter arrived at Patton's headquarters on August 20th. According to witnesses, Patton read it in silence, his face pale. Then he went to his private quarters and did not emerge for several hours. When he finally appeared, his eyes were red. He told his aide to arrange transportation to the hospitals and to schedule assemblies with every division. George Patton, The most aggressive general in the American Army, the man who feared nothing on the battlefield, was about to embark on the most humiliating experience of his life. He would apologize. He would humble himself before privates and sergeants. And he would pray that his career could somehow survive. The apology tour began on August 22nd. Patton visited both hospitals first. He met privately with Private Cool and Private Bennett. No official record exists of what was said in those meetings, but witnesses reported that Patton emerged looking shaken. He shook hands with the medical staff who had witnessed the incidents. He thanked them for their service and asked for their understanding. Then came the division assemblies. Patton stood before thousands of soldiers at a time, men who had followed him across Sicily, men who had seen friends die under his command. He told them that he had made a serious error in judgment. He told them that he had failed to recognize the genuine suffering of soldiers with battle fatigue. He told them that he was sorry. The reactions varied. Some soldiers accepted the apology with respect. Others were uncomfortable seeing their commanding general humiliate himself. A few were angry, believing the soldiers he slapped deserved worse. But most simply wanted the matter to be finished. They had a war to fight. They needed their general focused on defeating Germans, not apologizing for mistakes. By early September, Patton had addressed every division in 7th Army. He believed the matter was closed. He was wrong. 3,000 miles away, a journalist named Drew Pearson was about to destroy everything. The press corps covering the Sicilian campaign had known about the slapping incidents almost immediately. War correspondents talked to soldiers, nurses, and doctors. The story spread through the press tent within days of the second incident. But something unusual happened. The journalist chose not to report it. This was partly due to Eisenhower's direct intervention. The Supreme Commander invited the senior correspondents to a private meeting and made an extraordinary request. He explained that Patton was essential to the war effort. He explained that publicizing the incidents would force him to relieve Patton of command. He asked the journalists, as patriotic Americans, to suppress the story for the good of the Allied cause. The correspondents agreed. For 3 months, dozens of journalists who knew about the slapping incidents kept silent. They filed stories about battles and casualties and strategy, never mentioning the most explosive scandal in the American military. It was an act of self-censorship that would be unthinkable today. But in 1943, with the outcome of the war still uncertain, many journalists believed their duty to the nation outweighed their duty to report every story. This gentleman's agreement held until November, when a columnist named Drew Pearson decided he had stayed silent long enough. November 21st, 1943. Drew Pearson, one of the most influential journalists in America, broadcast his weekly radio program to millions of listeners. His voice crackled through radio speakers in living rooms across the nation. I have information about an incident involving General George S. Patton that has been suppressed by military authorities. Pearson then described the slapping incidents in vivid detail. He told listeners about the shell-shocked soldiers, the slaps, the drawn pistol, the threats of execution. He described Eisenhower's secret letter and the apology tour. By the time the broadcast ended, telephone switchboards at newspapers and radio stations across America were overwhelmed. The story exploded into the biggest military scandal of the war. Newspapers ran banner headlines. Editorials demanded Patton's dismissal. Members of Congress called for investigations. Angry citizens wrote thousands of letters to the War Department demanding that Patton be court-martialed. Secretary of War Henry Stimson was besieged with questions. Eisenhower faced intense pressure to explain why he had protected a general who assaulted hospitalized soldiers. The carefully constructed agreement with the press had collapsed, and Patton's career now hung by the thinnest possible thread. The public reaction split along surprising lines. Many Americans were outraged by Patton's behavior and demanded his removal. Gold Star mothers, whose sons had died in combat, wrote letters expressing horror that a general would abuse soldiers suffering from the trauma of war. Medical professionals condemned Patton's ignorance of battle fatigue, which they were only beginning to understand as a legitimate condition, but thousands of other Americans rallied to Patton's defense. They sent letters to newspapers arguing that cowards deserved to be slapped. They praised Patton as a tough commander who did not tolerate weakness. Some veterans of the First World War wrote that they wished more generals had Patton's iron discipline. The controversy revealed deep divisions in American society about the nature of courage, the treatment of psychological wounds, and the acceptable behavior of military leaders. Congress debated whether to hold hearings. Eisenhower submitted detailed reports defending his decision to retain Patton. The War Department conducted its own investigation. For weeks, the slapping scandal dominated American news coverage, briefly pushing actual combat operations to secondary headlines. Patton himself remained in Sicily, officially still commanding 7th Army, but effectively sidelined. He had become too controversial to use but too valuable to discard. He was in limbo, waiting to learn if he had any future left. Eisenhower made his final decision in late November. He would not relieve Patton of command. He would not court-martial him. He would not send him home. But neither would he give Patton a combat assignment for the foreseeable future. Instead, Patton would be transferred to England to participate in the deception operation for the invasion of France. The Germans believed Patton was the best American general. They expected him to lead any major invasion, so the Allies would use that belief against them. Patton would command a fictitious unit called the 1st United States Army Group. He would make public appearances in southeastern England. He would attend events and give speeches. German intelligence would observe all of this and conclude that the invasion would come at Calais, where Patton was apparently preparing to strike. Meanwhile, the real invasion force would assemble in secret for the assault on Normandy, far from where the Germans expected. It was a brilliant use of Patton's reputation, but for Patton himself, it was torture. He was being used as a decoy while other generals led the actual invasion. He had gone from conquering Sicily to commanding a phantom army that existed only on paper. The slapping incidents had cost him his place in the most important military operation of the century, January 1944. Patton arrived in England to assume his new role. He was miserable. While Omar Bradley, once his subordinate, prepared to command American ground forces on D-Day, Patton attended tea parties and made carefully staged public appearances. German reconnaissance planes photographed inflatable tanks and plywood aircraft that represented his fake army. German intelligence analysts concluded that Patton would lead the main invasion force. The deception was working perfectly, but Patton felt like a circus performer rather than a combat commander. He wrote in his diary during this period, expressing his anguish, "I am being used as a decoy while lesser men prepare for battle. My career is effectively over because I slapped a coward." He considered resigning. He considered requesting transfer to the Pacific. He considered every option except patience, which had never been his strength. Then, in late April, Patton nearly destroyed himself again. During a speech to a British women's club, he made political comments about America and Britain ruling the world after the war. He failed to mention the Soviet Union, a crucial ally. The remarks became public and created another firestorm. Eisenhower seriously considered sending Patton home. For days, Patton's fate hung in the balance again, but ultimately, Eisenhower decided he could not afford to lose Patton before the invasion. The Germans would notice his absence and might suspect the Normandy deception. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Patton was not there. He remained in England, maintaining the fiction that the real invasion was still coming at Calais. He listened to radio reports of the landings. He read casualty figures. He watched other generals lead the operation he should have commanded. For 6 more weeks, Patton continued his deception role while American forces fought to expand the Normandy beachhead. The campaign bogged down in the hedgerow country of Normandy, exactly the kind of grinding defensive warfare that Patton hated. Then, in late July, Eisenhower finally decided the time had come. The Normandy breakout was imminent. The Allies needed someone to exploit the breakthrough with speed and aggression. They needed Patton. On August 1st, 1944, almost exactly 1 year after the slapping incidents, George S. Patton assumed command of the 3rd United States Army in France. He had spent 12 months in purgatory. He had been humiliated, sidelined, and used as a prop. But now, finally, he was back in the war. What happened next would determine whether the slapping scandal was a temporary setback or the defining moment of his career. Patton unleashed 3rd Army with a fury that shocked everyone, including the Germans. In the first 2 weeks of August, his forces advanced over 400 miles across France. They moved so fast that supply lines could not keep up. They captured towns before German defenders knew they were coming. They liberated Paris. They reached the German border before anyone thought possible. The same qualities that had caused the slapping incidents, the explosive temper, the absolute intolerance for anything he perceived as weakness, the burning need to attack, now drove the most successful American military campaign of the war. Patton was not a changed man. He was the same aggressive, profane, brilliant, impossible commander he had always been. But now his aggression was directed entirely at the enemy. In December, when German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes, it was Patton who pivoted 3rd Army 90 degrees in 48 hours and raced north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Military historians still consider this maneuver one of the most remarkable in modern warfare. The man who had nearly been sent home in disgrace was now saving the Allied position in Western Europe. Patton crossed the Rhine before Montgomery. He drove deep into Germany. He liberated concentration camps and forced German civilians to witness the horrors their government had created. By May 1945, his 3rd Army had advanced further and faster than any other Allied force. The slapping scandal, which had seemed so devastating 18 months earlier, had become a footnote. History would remember Patton for his victories, not his mistakes. But Patton himself never forgot what had happened in those Sicilian hospitals. In his diary, he occasionally returned to the incidents with a mixture of regret and defiance. He acknowledged that he had been wrong to strike soldiers suffering from genuine psychological conditions. He admitted that his understanding of battle fatigue had been limited, but he also maintained that his fundamental instinct was correct. Aggressive leadership required intolerance for anything that looked like cowardice. A commander who accepted excuses would never win battles. He had expressed that belief in the worst possible way, and he had paid a terrible price. But he had never stopped believing it. That contradiction, the combination of genuine regret and stubborn self-justification, would define Patton's memory of the slapping incidents for the rest of his life. December 9th, 1945. 7 months after Germany's surrender, George S. Patton was paralyzed in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. He died 12 days later, without ever leaving his hospital bed. He was 60 years old. In the flood of obituaries and tributes that followed, the slapping incidents received brief mention, usually as evidence of Patton's volatile temperament. But the focus was overwhelmingly on his victories. He was remembered as America's greatest combat general, the man who conquered Sicily, raced across France, relieved Bastogne, and drove into the heart of Nazi Germany. The two soldiers he slapped, Private Paul Bennett and Private Charles Kuhl, both survived the war. Kuhl returned to Indiana and lived quietly until 1971. Bennett struggled with his mental health for years, but eventually recovered and raised a family. Neither man ever spoke publicly about the incidents. They carried their memories of that August day in Sicily to their graves. The slapping scandal nearly erased George S. Patton from history. It nearly cost the Allies their most aggressive commander at the moment they needed him most. But in the end, Patton's talent proved greater than his flaws. The same fire that drove him to strike those soldiers also drove him to victories that changed the course of the war. That is the impossible contradiction of George S. Patton, a man whose greatest strength and greatest weakness were exactly the same thing. Patton slapped two soldiers and almost lost everything. 12 months later, he commanded the fastest army in Europe. Some say Eisenhower should have sent him home. Others say keeping Patton won the war faster. But here is the real question. Can a man be both a great leader and deeply flawed at the same time? Does victory excuse cruelty? I want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and tell me. If you were Eisenhower in August 1943, what would you have done with Patton? Subscribe if you want more untold stories from history.